Hello and welcome back to TLDR's UK politics podcast, Starmergeddon. I'm your host, Georgina Finley, and I'm joined by the head of UK politics at TLDR News.
Yes.
Ben Blissett.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
And as usual, we have three sections to our podcast. We have our main topic discussion.
Yeah.
We have our cabinet review, which we always manage to twist
Yeah,
somehow.
it's never really a cabinet review,
and it's going to get twisted again today. Little teaser for you there.
Yeah.
And then we have our extra story. So let's just get into it.
Yeah.
So our main story today, given that it's parliamentary recess and there's not a whole load happening or going through Parliament at the moment.
Yeah.
Domestically, we're going to talk about a very broad topic, but this will be reform. So, Ben, why are we talking about reform in the context of opposition parties?
So, yeah, in obviously the main thing to say is that, as everybody is aware in the last year, their polling is incredibly strong. It's not just that they won. I mean, they won a small number of seats at the election last year. It was only 4 seats. And obviously that has varied depending on, as a result of a number of their MPs either, stepping down or there being scandals with them. Prime example of this is Rupert Lowe. But their composition in Parliament is quite low. But the main thing to note here, as I'm sure everybody is aware, that the political environment outside Parliament is very, very different at the minute to the one inside Parliament. The parties that are polling well are not represented very well in Westminster, and the main example of this is obviously Reform. I had a look at polling recently, and obviously Reform is still hovering around 30%. Conservatives and Labour still hovering around 20%, with Labour only slightly ahead. So Reform, in terms of actual polling and their reflection of the people at the minute, they are just the strongest party, and this has been consistent for months. We all know this. We've discussed this on the podcast for a while. But the reason that we're talking about this the reason I wanted to talk about this today isn't actually so much to do with their polling. It's to do more with their actions in the last sort of 12 months. And what I mean by this is whenever there's been anything pretty much the Labour government's done that's been controversial, which, as we all know, has been a lot of things. The winter fuel allowance, the taxation on farmers, the recent Online Safety Act. Reform seemed to do very, very well at sort of reflecting the public mood and attacking Labour. And I've been having a think about why is this? Why are Reform so good at this? And what I mean by this is not just that Reform's good at this, but the Conservatives are really quite bad at this. So Reform has almost defaulted into this role of the opposition and opposing Labour. So when it came to the winter fuel allowance, Reform were very, very vocal about this, really took the fight to Labour. Some of their attacks were a lot more sort of credible, I think, than the Conservatives' attacks. When it came to farmers, I mean, you saw with the farmers' protests in London, Farage was down there, tweed cap on, walking down the Westminster with all of these big tractors. We didn't see Badenoch do that. And I think she tried, but she just didn't attract any of the media attention. It didn't come across as credible. I think part of the, and just to wrap this up as well, sorry, the Online Safety Act, Reform have just outwardly said, we'll repeal it. We'll repeal it. And this has caused a huge argument with the Labour government. Obviously, we've already discussed Peter Kyle's comments on Nigel Farage being on the side of people like Jimmy Savile, which I think was a particularly disgusting statement for Peter Kyle to make, for being honest. But they've been just bold enough to say, we'll repeal it. The Conservatives are a bit more measured in their opposition. And what I think here, ultimately, is that the Conservatives have been in government for the last 14 years prior to Labour coming in. And a lot of these things that Labour are doing are either developments on or adjustments to policies introduced by the Conservatives, which make the Conservative opposition weaker and more measured and more tempered. Reform don't have to do that. Reform can just come out and say, no, we would reinstate the winter fuel allowance. We would completely scrap the Online Safety Act. They can be a lot more sort of bombastic in their opposition. And I think that makes them seem a lot more credible to ordinary people. Also, I think it's just worth saying that, again, we've discussed this a fair amount, but it's worth reiterating, Kemi Badenoch is not a good communicator. I think Robert Jenrick, in some of his sort of criticisms, they come across as a bit more genuine, but because he's not actually leader of the opposition, it's not taken as seriously by the media, so he doesn't really cut through. Farage is in this default role now where he can act as the main opposition, because not only because of his communication skills, but also because he hasn't got any baggage of 14 years of government sort of weighing him down and tempering his criticism. He's just in such a unique role at the minute. And I think in sort of any given situation, it's just so much easier for Farage to oppose the government and to make those sort of criticisms. And I think we've seen that over the last 12 months.
Yeah, that was super interesting. And I think you've given a really good rundown of the various reasons why Reform are doing so well and how they've managed to fill this vacant space for an opposition party. There were kind of three things that I've jotted down from that speech you've just given about what factors are shaping this, or where, why Reform are polling so well and why they're managing to cut through more than the Conservatives or Kemi Badenoch are. And there's three things I want to ask you about. One is media and Reform's relationship to the media, or the media's treatment of Reform. And this is, I think we could almost do our own sole podcast on media relations with political parties and how those things operate, because a lot of criticism, and I see it in our own comments as well sometimes, but across all parts of the media, is that Reform are given far more media attention than they deserve for such a small parliamentary party. And whether that is then becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the more you hear about the Reform, the better they do, the more exposure they get. Or is it working the other way around, where Reform are managing to attract that attention because they're just better? That's one thing I want to ask you about. Another thing I thought was such an interesting point was this stark difference between the political situation outside Parliament and inside Parliament. Because something we don't talk about enough as well is that, once again, Reform have 5 MPs, or 4 they were elected with, and yet they're polling well above, like 10 points above any other party outside. Where is that coming from? Is that performance outside Parliament actually because they have so few MPs? So there's we're not seeing infighting the same way possibly, or we're not seeing big rebellions against leadership in the way that we are with Labour and Starmer. That's something I also wanted to ask you about. And then the third thing I think was such a great point was that a lot of Labour's current policies are continuations of acts or bills that went through under the Conservatives. And so for all the change slogan that Labour were running on last year, actually it's a lot of continuation, really. And I think this is benefiting Reform as well. So sorry, there's 3 big things that I just pulled out of that.
Well, I'll just take those in turn. I think the first and second sort of play into each other. On the first point about whether the media gives them too much attention, and whether that's sort of a self-fulfilling cycle, it's tricky. I can see the argument that goes both ways, but ultimately, Farage is an interesting character, right? And not only that, but he's now got like an arm of the media in GB News that kind of are a mouthpiece in a lot of ways for Reform UK. And I mean, Farage was a host. I think he still is, isn't he? I think he still has a show on it, or at least he's on there quite a lot. Yeah. Either way, he's GB News is sort of quite friendly to Farage and Reform UK. But I think it's tricky because I think this is what I mean by I think it plays into the second point, that I don't think it's that the media are over-representing them. I think it's that the main thing is that politics at the minute in Parliament doesn't reflect the people. And I'm trying to think of an example more in history where that has been the case. And what I mean by that is that the parties that the people support are not the parties that are in Parliament. Reform are polling at 30% and they have 4 MPs. Labour have a massive majority and are polling at sub 20% in a lot of polls. Parliament at the minute does not reflect the people. So the question here is, do you think that the media should reflect parties as they are represented in Parliament, or should they reflect parties as they are polling in the wider public? If you subscribe to the former opinion, then yeah, sure, the media are over-representing Reform. They've got 4 MPs, and they've got, the media are treating them as if, they're the main opposition party, or in some instances even, a government in waiting. But if you subscribe to the latter opinion, then Reform are polling at 30%. They're 10 points. They're in almost double digits ahead in a lot of instances than the next nearest party, which is Labour. So no, they're not being overrepresented at all. They're being accurately represented because they are polling stronger than any other party. In fact, you could even argue that they're not being given enough media attention because they're the government in waiting. I think the real answer probably lies somewhere in between those two things, and that Reform previously had been given too much media attention, which has boosted their profile and put them into first place in the polls. And now, because they're in first place in the polls, that's sort of reinforcing itself now. I think that might have been a thing that sort of previously happened. But I think all of these questions sort of come back to the fact that Parliament doesn't currently reflect the people more widely. And that will always be the case to an extent because you don't have elections every week. But I think it's so egregious at the minute that questions like this are going to crop up for the next few years that I can't think of an instance. And I'd be very interested for people watching or listening if they have any examples that I'm sort of missing in recent memory where Parliament is so unreflective of the current attitude of the people. And what was your, I'm just forgetting your third point as well.
So my third point was, picking up on what you said about Labour basically continuing a lot of former Conservative Party policies, and the fact that this essentially makes it difficult for the Tories to critique anything that Labour are doing at the moment. Yeah,
and the perfect example, what I mean by that, the example that springs to mind is the Online Safety Act. And I'm sure that was the one you were probably thinking of as well, in that it was the Conservatives that, and this is the thing that I think people seem to forget, I think, about the Online Safety Act. This was a landmark piece of legislation that had its roots really back to 2017, 2018. And there were a number of times that the Conservative government had tried to implement this, but it had fallen for various reasons. And they only eventually managed to get it through in 2023 with a couple of clauses in there that would be implemented in the future after Ofcom had written guidance to big tech. And those rules only came in this year under the Labour government, but they were written by a Conservative government and obviously implemented by Ofcom, which is separate to government. So it was the Conservatives that had introduced the Online Safety Act. It was the Conservatives that wrote those rules, and it was Ofcom that had sort of introduced them. The only sort of hand that Labour had in them was that they didn't block them when they were in government. So sure, that this is still a thing. Peter Kyle still was the technology secretary under which the rules were written. I'm sure he had conversations with Ofcom as well about the implementation of the rules. But ultimately, this was a Conservative thing. So I think I think there was some mild opposition about it from the Conservatives, but they couldn't be as strong in their opposition as Reform because they were the ones that wrote it. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky for the Conservatives at the minute because, as I say, a lot of the bills that Labour are pushing through are either a continuation of Conservative or just an adjustment to Conservative policy.
Yeah. And final point before we move on to the next section of our podcast, this is something you wrote about in your recent video on Jenrick and the Conservatives. But the other interesting thing for me is that not only are Reform behaving like the main opposition party to government, but they're also being treated as such across the political spectrum. And this is also really interesting to me. So give us 1 minute on your kind of analysis of that.
Very quickly, what I mean by this is to do with things outside Parliament. Inside Parliament, obviously, there's all the official mechanisms. The Conservatives are still the official opposition. But
we should make that super, super clear.
Yes, that is very important. So they're not the official opposition. The official opposition are the Conservatives. But outside of Parliament, media are generally going to Reform and are giving Reform airtime whenever there is opposition. And Labour are treating them as the opposition as well. And what I mean by this, again, the Online Safety Act is just the most recent example, so it seems the most obvious. Labour were spending most of their time responding to criticisms from Reform. Peter Kyle got himself into a spat with Nigel Farage over his comments. It feels like Labour aren't even bothering with the Conservatives at the minute. And I think part of it is if we just don't give the Conservatives airtime, they can't rebuild, I've said this multiple times on here, the main reason that Kemi Badenoch is failing is because she can't get media attention. And Labour, I think their strategy is, if we just don't respond to them, it makes it even harder for them to get media attention because their critiques aren't even taken seriously. So with Reform, Labour are just sort of, they're having to respond to their attacks because they're the ones their criticisms are the ones being given airtime by the media, which means that they're the main things that they're the main criticisms that Labour feel that they have to respond to. And this is how we get into situations like we've gotten ourselves in recently, where Peter Kyle has got into an argument with Nigel Farage. And I know that we've spoken a lot about the Online Safety Act, but this isn't just that. If you go back to the farmers' protests, Farage was the one that was being taken more seriously by the media, and Labour were responding to him. I think this is a trend that we're seeing, and I think Labour are just so aware of the polling at the minute that they feel the need to dedicate more time to Farage. You see this in PMQs as well. You see the number of times that Keir Starmer mentions Nigel Farage, the member for Clacton, in PMQs, and feels that he has to do these like little jokes and these little sort of like digs at Farage to try and weaken him a bit. They're not bothering that much with the Conservatives because I think they feel like it's not really worthwhile.
Fascinating. And this leads us on nicely to our cabinet review. But as always, before we get there, we're going to tell you about our wonderful new magazine, Too Long, which is now in stock. Every previous edition of Too Long, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah, I can count on the store. And there's a code on screen now. If you use this code, you can get 20% off. Every edition is in stock. So if you're a collector, you can gather them all. And the most recent edition, Ben, what was give us one article that you liked yourself and one feature or article from someone else.
Well, in terms of the one that I wrote, I think the most relevant to this episode is whether Farage could become the next Prime Minister. It sort of recounts Farage's political history, how we got to this situation with Farage in first place in the polls, his multiple different political outfits, the UKIP years, how he became Mr. Brexit following the 2016 decision to leave the EU. It's kind of a history of Farage and how we got to where we are, which, given the topic we've spoken about today, I'm assuming some people are interested in, and I think this is only going to become more salient in the next few years as we edge ever closer to the next election. In terms of articles by other people, I've said this a number of times on this podcast, the article by Nadja on penal colonies, 21st century penal colonies.
We all love that one.
Everybody loves that one, and rightly so. It's very well written, and I think it's a topic that nobody would have thought would be cropping back up in the 21st century. I think it's very, very important. Are there any articles that you particularly like in there?
Well, you've stolen my favourite one.
Oh, apologies.
But I guess shout out to the letters. We've not spoken enough about the letters. But that was also thanks to you guys who listened on Starmergeddon and wrote in. I really enjoyed the letters that we received, especially from the high school student in Wisconsin. Or is Milwaukee in Wisconsin? I think it was one of the two.
I don't like my lack of American geography being shown up on the podcast.
Yeah,
fairness.
me too. I mean, this is a UK politics podcast. We can get away with it.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed that
when they know
letter.
where like Colchester is, then I'll know where like Wisconsin is. Like I feel like that's
yeah. But yeah, shout out to the letters as well. It's the first time we've included them in the magazine, and they'll be in every future edition as well. And I know we already have one in response to your Farage article. So
oh no,
you're gonna get torn apart.
Negative.
I don't know. I haven't read it yet.
Oh no.
But we will be getting one.
Okay.
So yeah, that's too long.
My day.
That's too long. Make sure you grab a copy if you haven't already. And as I say, everything's in stock now. Use the code on screen and you can get it all. Fill up your shelf. Yeah. Now we come to the next part of our podcast, which is our cabinet review.
Yes.
And as is tradition on this podcast, we're slightly stretching our definition of cabinet. This time,
I think this is possibly the biggest stretch we've done yet.
Probably the biggest stretch, yeah. Not to talk about Starmer's cabinet,
Not
which
in
we're
any
supposed
way
to.
his cabinet, no.
But instead, we're going to talk about the shadow cabinet.
The shadow cabinet,
and
yeah.
specifically,
you didn't know that would technically be counted in the cabinet review.
We're going to have to
we
do
didn't specify
Scarlet.
Which cabinet. Yeah.
Scarlett will have to do the chapter with the brackets.
Yeah.
Shadow.
We're going to do historical cabinets
cabinet
next,
review.
and we're going to do other countries' cabinets. We're really breaking the sort of like line on what a cabinet is now. IKEA cabinet.
Yeah, honestly, cabinet in Starmer's office.
Anything's possible now.
Yeah. What's he got on his shelf? I don't know, actually. Probably lots of bottles of alcohol. And too long, he should buy a copy. So we're going to talk about Shadow Justice Minister Robert Jenrick.
Yes. Famous member of the UK cabinet.
AKA Bobby J.
Bobby J. So he's obviously, as you've said, Shadow Cabinet. Technically, he's the Shadow Justice Minister. But that's not why we're going to be talking about him today. It's because more of his. There's a phrase for it that I'm sort of trying to reach for. It's like maybe not a soft launch, but it's something like that. No, that's the wrong phrase, isn't it?
Robert Jenrick soft launching his leadership bit.
Is that it? No, it's not.
It kind of is, yeah.
It kind of. He's acting on social media and elsewhere as if he's already the leader of the opposition. I think he's constantly. Conservative Home do these like monthly polls of the shadow cabinet league tables, and he's often out in front. Now he ran against Kemi Badenoch last year in the leadership election. He lost to her, but it was a relatively competitive election, and it was a lot closer than people were expecting. I think it was about 57%, something like that, for Kemi Badenoch. And I think technically it was the closest since the Conservative membership, were able to vote on leaders. But that's only really because the leadership elections are usually not that close. But the reason that we're talking about him is just because I think we're getting closer and closer to him being able to succeed Kemi Badenoch. She has 12 months immunity under the 1922 committee rules.
As of the date she became leader.
As of the date she became leader, which was the 2nd of November. Yep. So we're getting closer and closer to that. But Robert Jenrick is just, I think depending on who you ask, his communications online are either quite slick, quite a good representation of right-wing attitudes. They're able to start national conversations. His most prominent one, I think, was his video of stopping fare dodgers on the underground, which starts a conversation about fare dodging, and then sort of more general crime in London and attitudes towards crime. I think that was something that Badenoch's not been able to do at all, really, since becoming leader, was starting these conversations on policy. He was able to do that, and I think that is, as I've said a number of times, the main job of an opposition leader is to garner media attention. And I think he's demonstrably been able to do that better than Badenoch. But I mean, again, it depends on how you look at his communications. I know that some political journalists, I think particularly Alistair Campbell and that, the rest of his politics, have been a bit more critical, saying that he seems to think that being leader of the opposition or being an opposition figure is just making slick videos on social media, and it's not. And I get it, it's not just that, but I genuinely think that in the 21st century, the main role of the opposition is to get media attention for your cause. And I don't think I don't think Kemi Badenoch's been good at that. And I think he's trying to show the Conservative membership that he is able to. And I think he's been quite successful. And I think the reflection of that is the fact that he is constantly first by some margin in these Conservative home polls, which suggests that if there is another Conservative leadership election, he'd be a shoo-in and he'd win.
But what do you think the chances of that leadership election taking place are? Because one of the main themes that came through the Tory leadership contest in 2024 was, we're a party that's been through five leaders in 6 years.
You'd think it'd be
we have to stop this kind of merry-go-round of leaders.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the sensible opinion, isn't it? That they just need to pick a leader and stick with it. And I think that was the framing of last year's leadership election. But the thing that you learn quite quickly about the Conservatives is that they are absolutely cutthroat with their leaders. And this isn't a modern thing. If you go back to the early 2000s with Ian Duncan Smith, they switched their leaders quite frequently, not as frequently, but for the time, quite frequently in the early 2000s. They can say that last year, but ultimately, I think they believed that last year. I think they've now are coming to the opinion that it would be better to switch leaders than to stick with Badenoch. And in terms of how likely do we think that is? Well, they need 15% of the Conservative parliamentary party, 18 MPs at the minute, in order to trigger a leadership election. So the question you need to ask yourself is, do you think that there are 18 Conservative MPs that don't like Badenoch? And I think that's quite obviously yes. So I think it's I think once we get to the 2nd of November, my prediction, and again, I'm so bad with political predictions, so it almost certainly won't happen now I've said it publicly, but I think we'll get to the 2nd of November, and I don't think it'll be too long after that they'll reach the 18-letter threshold.
Interesting.
You need to ask yourself the question, are there 18 MPs that believe that Robert Jenrick would be a better leader than Badenoch? And I think there probably are. And then if that happens, it triggers a Conservative leadership election. Badenoch is eligible to stand. I don't know, maybe she would stand. And then I think Jenrick would win that, and I think he'd then become. And I think for the Conservatives' point of view, if you're going to switch leader, it's better to do it soon rather than closer to the election. Let them establish themselves. Let them start to recover in the. If you think that that leader would be better at recovering in the polls, better to get that poll recovery in early and to try and hold it. So yeah, I think that's quite.
Well, that's something we should keep an eye on then over the next few months. See
Definitely.
what changes. And finally, the last section of our podcast, we're really flying through it today, is our extra story. And since it is Starmergeddon, of course, we have to talk about Keir Starmer himself. And we're just going to talk about Starmer's kind of international diplomacy skills and that disjunction that we've talked about on this podcast before between his domestic perception and his perception on the international stage.
Yeah, I think this is a thing that sort of crops up semi-regularly on this podcast, I think. So I think we discussed it a few months back, and he's just not doing well domestically at all. I don't think he can find his footing. We've said it so many times that he doesn't seem to have a narrative to sell. He seems to sort of be veering between topics, sort of hoping that this is the one that'll land with the public and this is the one that they'll get behind him on. And I just don't think any of it's landing. Internationally, I think he's trying to he's walking a very, very thin line between sort of maintaining the Western sort of liberal order, I suppose, or at least the influence of Europe within the West, and maintaining Europe's relevance, I suppose, against sort of a Donald Trump presidency in which he wants to be the only figure really in the West, and cozying up to Trump as well, and trying to get on Trump's good side. And I think that's a difficult line to walk. And he sometimes gets himself in hot water with that. But on the whole, I think he's doing that quite well. And I think he's quite respected for that. I think that he's becoming more comfortable dealing with international topics than domestic ones. And I think the actions on Monday this week, the meeting at the White House with the other European leaders, with Zelensky, I think is a good demonstration of this, in that it looks like Starmer's opinions being taken seriously. He's there with other senior Western figures. Not that many people were invited in the whole. He's quite close with Zelensky now. It seems like one of the main things he wanted to get from that meeting was some security guarantees for Ukraine, which he seems to have achieved in some sense. I think Trump had confirmed that there'd be some American security provided to Ukraine in the event of a long-lasting, ceasefire. Starmer's been sort of been pushing this coalition of the willing idea, that Western countries, particularly the UK, would provide boots on the ground in Ukraine to maintain any sort of peace agreement signed between Ukraine and Russia. That seems to have gone down well with the president. So it seems like he's just so much more comfortable on the international stage, and he seems to be quite respected and on the whole be doing so much better internationally than he is doing domestically.
So that brings an end to this episode of Starmergeddon. Thanks for sticking with us, and let us know in the comments what you think about anything we've discussed in this podcast episode. And actually, we've never really asked our audience for suggestions for what they would like to see us talk about in Starmergeddon.
I'd love that. I'd love to see
that would be cool though. Yeah,
absolutely.
Let us know, especially because, as we said, parliamentary recess, not much going on in Westminster. So if you guys have ideas for what you would like us to talk about in the next few weeks, drop them in the comments. Check out Too Long on our store, and have a great few weeks until we see you next.
Yeah.
Bye.